Good day and welcome back to The Shed. Today we go back to 1972 and take a look at the Hugo and Nebula Award-winning novel for that year by Isaac Asimov, The Gods Themselves. So what I would like to do, as always, is provide a spoiler-free plot overview, talk to what I liked, what I didn't like, I'll make some recommendations. I'll put this one to the memory test and we'll rank it on our ever-growing sci-fi shed ladder, where I've been ranking all these novels. So this is an interesting one because I read online that the novel came about because Robert Silverberg, who's one of my all-time favorite authors, was having a conversation with Isaac Asimov, and they came up with this conversation, and Silverberg, in error, said something like plutonium-189, in which Asimov responded saying, well, that's impossible, that isotope could just not exist in our universe at least. And Silverberg, as the story goes, challenged him to write a novel about this, and what we end up with is The Gods Themselves. So the novel was written in 3 parts. It was first released in serialized format in both the If and Galaxy magazines. So it's written in 3 discrete parts, and it sort of reads like a fix-up novel, but it was always intended to be these 3 short stories combined together. So what's rather interesting about the title of this one is that it comes out of a play called The Maid of Orleans, from a guy called Friedrich Schiller. I've not read it, and if you have, I'd love to hear your comments on it, but it sort of perked my interest. But the quote goes like this: "Against stupidity, the gods themselves contend in vain," which takes us straight into the first part of the novel, which is titled Against Stupidity. And what we have is this guy called Hallam. He's a radiochemist, and he's just discovered some kind of exchange of isotopes between what appears to be a parallel universe. He sort of discovered that, you know, when under certain conditions we have this titanium that can turn into this plutonium-148, and there's some kind of nuclear reaction that takes place that gives us basically endless, clean and cheap energy source. So this is sort of like a godsend, right? This is like, wow, fantastic. We have access to this literally endless energy, and what seems to be at no cost at all. But the whole of the scientific community is not quite convinced, and we have this other guy in, what was his name? A guy called Lamont, who's partnered up with this guy called Borowski, who's an archaeologist, and they're trying to communicate with these paramen, trying to get an understanding of who they are, what is their purpose, how does this exchange benefit them, and all doesn't seem to be quite as at first appears. Part 2 is called The Gods Themselves, and we now find ourselves in the midst of these alien beings in a parallel universe. And there seems to be 2 different types, these hard ones and these soft ones. The soft ones appear to be some kind of energy being, and they have a very interesting reproductive life cycle in this triad of sorts. And what we learned is that one of these beings in this triad, a person or an individual called Jua, at least, seems to be a little bit disgruntled with her place in the universe. So she starts to ask some questions, trying to seek understanding, and starts to probe into this pump, this electron pump, and its exchange, and what it may mean to not just their universe, but to our universe back here on Earth. Part 3, called Contend in Vain, takes place on the moon, and it centers around this guy called Dennison. And he's been discredited back on Earth because of his opposition to Hallam, the guy who invented that electron pump, because he was trying to highlight the potential dangers in this exchange. So he finds himself on the moon, still experimenting, trying to see if there's a safer, alternate way that we could benefit from this electron exchange. So what a fascinating novel this one was, and what is it in particular that I liked? So what is there to like in Isaac Asimov's The Gods Themselves? For me, the primary thing I took away from this one was the concept. I really liked that idea of this multiverse, these parallel universes, and how the laws of physics could be different in these universes, and how we may be able to exploit that. I like the concept of us trying to communicate with these alien beings, and what would that look like, and how would we go about establishing some kind of communication channel. So I thought that was very interesting concept indeed. The other thing I always find enjoyable in Isaac Asimov's writing is this use of science. Now, this is a hard science fiction novel, and I would say that the science seems to stand up even in today's times. Now, I'm no physicist, so I'll caveat my comments with that, but it does seem to be rather plausible, the science that it brings to this novel. So very interesting, very plausible hard science fiction. The other thing that I really enjoyed as well was these alien creatures in a parallel universe. I thought they were rather fascinating creatures. I really enjoyed this mating trio that they had, and we've seen something similar in other novels, and I wondered just how much of an inspiration Asimov was to those others that followed him. But I did enjoy that take on these very strange different alien beings and how the laws of physics may influence these life forms if they were completely different to ours. So what is there not to like in Isaac Asimov's The Gods Themselves? Look, this one was a very enjoyable read, and I always struggle with trying to pick things when I find, I enjoyed the novel overall. But I'd have to say that for me, I don't think the three short stories really work together as a novel as a whole. I can understand why he did it, and it sort of does work, but from my personal experience, I just found it, I wish it just had read like a normal novel, right? So I just didn't find those three stories to quite gel together. The other thing I'd have to say is that Isaac Asimov's characters are never his strong point, right? And I'd have to say that it's the same with this as well. The characters are okay, but they don't seem to really bring anything new, exciting to the genre. I just found them to be a little bit weak and a little bit carbon copy of each other, to be honest, as well. So again, I say Isaac Asimov's, his characters are definitely not what I take away from his novels. It's always for me the concept, which takes me straight to the memory test. And I guess what I've just talked to in my dislike section is sort of what I take away from this when I revisit it. I think it's been 25, almost 30 years since I last read The Gods Themselves. But what I would have to say is that first part, when we learn about the electron pump and its use, was very strong. I really remember that quite clearly, which I was sort of surprised, to be honest. I wasn't expecting it to have the lasting impact that it had, but I could definitely remember the first part of the novel. I did remember glimpses of the second part when we're talking about these alien creatures, but the third part when they're on the moon, honestly, I'd have to say that bit I couldn't remember at all, nor could I really remember the ending, which sort of summarizes my whole novel experience here, right? Which is very strong concept, characters are a bit weak, and the ending's not quite have the punch or the impact that I was expecting it to have. When it comes to recommendations, I mentioned in my last review of Timescape that there are some similarities here in Timescape with what we see in The Gods Themselves. So I'd say if you've enjoyed books like, Timescape in the past, I'd say have a go at Isaac Asimov's The Gods Themselves. I think you will enjoy it. Now, when it comes to Isaac Asimov novels, I'd have to say that I'm not quite sure if I would recommend The Gods Themselves as a place to start with Isaac Asimov. It is a wonderful novel, don't get me wrong, but I'd rather say, have a go at something like The Caves of Steel, which this is a really good introduction to his whole robot series. I think, I'd rather say have a go at this. But probably more so, I would say have a go at Foundation. I'm holding here Foundation and Empire, which is one of the sequels, but I much prefer the Foundation series more so than I did The God Themselves. So I'd have to say from an Isaac Asimov perspective, I'd say have a go at Foundation before you had a go at The Gods Themselves. Now, if you like books like A Case of Conscience by James Blish, I thought there was a really interesting question here about alien life and what it does. And again, I see similarities in The Gods Themselves. So I'd say if you've enjoyed James Blish, The Case of Conscience in the past, I'd say have a go at Isaac Asimov's The Gods Themselves. I think you will be pleased. We've got to rank it on our ever-growing sci-fi shed ladder. Geez, it's going to be difficult. Let's flip the cameras and see where this one takes us. So back to the shed ladder and ranking tonight's 1972 Hugo and Nebula Award winning novel by Isaac Asimov. And this is going to be rather interesting to see where this one lands when I look at my input criteria. Because when it comes to concept, this one got just about full marks for the concept. I really did enjoy the concept of that multiverse and these really interesting alien beings and how they worked and operated, which I thought was fantastic. But it lost a few marks when it comes to execution because of those three stories, right? I just don't feel that it flowed the way it ought to as a standalone novel, that it didn't quite work for me in execution. The other thing I would say about Isaac Asimov is that you never really, at least my experience is, you don't read Asimov for his characters. For me, it's always been about his ideas, right? And again, he lost a few marks when it comes to the characters in this novel, but where it did redeem itself is in the writing. I'm a big fan of Isaac Asimov, and I really enjoy his writing, so I got a few extra marks for his writing. Where it failed again a little was in that memory test, and I think it's got largely to do with those 3 stories, because they all end in different ways. And I think as a novel as a whole, what makes a novel really memorable for me is the ending. And it lost a couple of marks in this ending because it didn't quite have the impact that it should have had, for me at least, which goes straight into my memory test as well, where it again lost some points, because I think one of the things that makes novels really memorable for me is that ending. And again, I don't think this one delivered on it, so it lost a couple of marks on the memory test. And when I punched in the numbers, it took me somewhere around here, right, around the Big Time and Timescape. So let's start with The Big Time by Fritz Leiber, because I sort of mentioned in that one as well that I really love the concept of the big time, really fascinating way that, you know, events could impact timelines, right? Wonderful concept, some really clever one-line ideas that I wish had been expanded on. But overall, it really failed in execution, and that's why one of my all-time favorite books in many ways, and The Big Time by Fritz Leiber, is ranking the way it is. And same goes with Timescape. Again, I found that to be a rather interesting concept, and again, it was one that was more an ideas-driven novel than it was a character or plot-driven novel. And again, it reflects itself on the board because of those reasons. And when I crunched my numbers, it sort of had me sitting around about here, to be honest, right? But there's just something about Asimov's writing that just I could not place anywhere near these two, because I look at things like, you know, what else we got on the Siege side, on books like The Quantum Rose, and The Terminal Experiment to some degree, and Serial Justice, and A Memory Called Empire, and I just couldn't rank Asimov below those novels. And there's just something, there's a magical quality to Asimov that my input criteria when I use to weigh these novels doesn't quite capture today. There's an emotive force behind Asimov's writing, and we see that in books like Philip K. Dick's and Robert Silverberg. It evokes some kind of feeling inside of me that just says, this is wonderful, and I haven't been able to quantify exactly what that is, but I'm going to continue to grow as a reader, and I'm going to see if I can somehow capture the essence of what makes these authors just wonderful that my criteria is not currently picking up today. So there is an additional criteria here that is not documented that definitely influences my liking, and I've made up my mind offline, and I'm going to say that Isaac Asimov's The God Themselves is going to sit towards the top of the seaside, just below The Saint of Bright Doors by Vajra Chandrasekhara. And what a great debut novel that one is. And I'm going to give The Saint of Bright Doors just a slight edge, because I thought that was a wonderful novel by a wonderful person from the little exchange that I've had with him online. He's just a great author, really great ideas, great concepts, and I think that novel will prove itself to be a rather memorable one. And it just read as a novel, right? Which disjointed at times and rather interesting in itself. So I'm going to give The Saint of Bright Doors the slight edge over The God Themselves. Interesting, maybe a bit controversial, but that's where we sit tonight. Again, it's a rather interesting one because, you know, we got books like The Man in a High Castle by PKD, one of my all-time favorite authors, but not necessarily what I would say is one of his best novels. Same goes with Robert Silverberg's A Time of Changes, wherever that is at the moment. Here it is. Again, Robert Silverberg is my favorite author, but that's not necessarily his favorite book. My favorite book of his. And same with Isaac Asimov. Again, one of my favorite authors, not necessarily my favorite book of his, and it's reflected on the board. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where would you have ranked Isaac Asimov's The God Themselves? It's a good novel. I loved it from cover to cover, but that's where we stand tonight. As always, I'd love to hear your feedback, and I'll see you next time. I'm reading another classic at the moment, so I hope you join me soon, and you hit that notification and subscribe button, whatever it is, so you don't miss out. And I'll see you next time in the shed.